The wind howled through the valleys of a remote Scottish village nestled between towering mountains. A lone shepherd named Elias tended to his flock of sheep, a quiet and simple existence he'd led for years. His sheep were his livelihood and his only companions on the desolate plains, far from any neighboring town. But there was one place Elias had always avoided, the abandoned house on the far edge of the field. The house had stood for decades, long forsaken and rotting in the shadows of the hills. It was said to have once belonged to a wealthy family, but their fate had become a dark legend, whispered only by the few elders still alive to remember. Some said the house was cursed, others that it was haunted by the spirits of those who'd lived there. Elias never believed in ghosts or curses, but something about the house made the air colder, the ground less fertile, and the sheep uneasy. They too stayed clear of its boundaries, as though an invisible line had been drawn. One chilly autumn evening, as Elias guided his sheep back to their pen, something peculiar happened. The sheep nearest to the abandoned house stopped, their ears twitching nervously. Then, one by one, they turned and bolted toward the old house, bleating in a frenzy as though being called by an unseen force. The shepherd froze, heart pounding in his chest. He swore he heard his name. But there was no one around. No human voice, no signs of life. It was just him, the wind, and the flock that was rapidly disappearing into the house's open doorway. Panicked, Elias ran after them, shouting for his sheep to return, but they vanished into the darkness of the house. His voice echoed back to him, swallowed by the emptiness within. Reluctantly, he approached the entrance. The door creaked on its rusty hinges, and the moment he crossed the threshold, a deep chill settled over him, colder than the wind outside. The house was a decaying labyrinth, its walls covered in grime and peeling wallpaper, and a foul smell hung in the air, like rot and death. He stepped further in, heart hammering in his chest. His lantern cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. The silence inside was deafening, yet his pulse thrummed louder than ever. As he moved from room to room, calling out for his sheep, an unsettling realization began to sink in. It wasn't the house that frightened him, but the silence, the absence of any sound from his sheep. Then, in a small room at the back of the house, he found them, or what was left of them. The sight made him retch. His entire flock lay in a heap, their bodies twisted and torn apart, as if by some unseen force. Their eyes, glassy and lifeless, stared blankly at the ceiling. Blood pooled beneath them, dark and sticky, reflecting the light of his lantern. But there were no tracks, no signs of an animal attack, no indication of how they had met their grisly end. Only death, sudden and inexplicable. Elias stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat. His mind raced to comprehend what he was seeing, but the more he stared at the pile of corpses, the more a terrible thought took hold of him. Something had brought his sheep here. Something inside this house. He turned slowly, trembling, his lantern shaking in his hand. Suddenly, the temperature dropped further, and a wind gusted through the house, slamming the door behind him. His vision blurred as the lantern flickered and died, plunging the room into complete darkness. And then he felt it. A cold from a different world, a cold in his bones, a cold that began to consume him from the inside. At that moment, he knew that hell was not hot. The last thing Elias felt before everything went dark was the darkness tightening like a deadly embrace. Days later, the villagers noticed that Elias and his flock had not returned. A search party was sent. But when they approached the abandoned house, they found no trace of the shepherd or his sheep. The house stood silent and still, its doors closed, its windows dark. No one dared to enter, not after what had happened. Sometimes on cold autumn nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the distant bleating of sheep carried on the wind. And if you're unlucky enough to wander too close to the old house, you might just hear Elias too, calling for help from the shadows within.